My name is Linda Harper. And I'm 62. I've lived alone for years now. Ever since my husband passed. And I thought I understood what peace felt like. But nothing could have prepared me for the morning my son Ethan showed up at my door. Before the sun had even stretched across the sky. That knock, it wasn't just a knock. It carried the weight of urgency and entitlement all at once. The kind of knock only he could give. I remember standing there with my tea half drunk, feeling the chill of the early morning seep into my bones. Through the window, I could see his sleek black SUV parked haphazardly across the driveway, as if the world bent around him. When he stepped inside, he moved like he owned the space, his eyes glued to his phone, an envelope tucked under his arm. There was no warmth, no greeting, just a sense that something heavy was coming my way. He handed me the envelope, and my hands trembled before I even opened it. Inside were statements, notices, and a contract marked in bold, red, $300,000. The amount hit me like a punch. I felt my chest tighten, my mind racing through decades of hard work and careful saving. That money, every bit of it, was meant to be my safety net, my comfort for these later years. And here it was, demanded as if it were owed. As if love meant compliance. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the papers, feeling the impossible choice pressing down on me. I could see his face, calm and expectant. And I remembered all the times I had taught him to rely on others, to believe family always comes first. And now, that lesson was coming back to me in the hardest way possible. It was the kind of morning that changes everything. The kind that makes you question what love, loyalty, and sacrifice really mean. And in that quiet kitchen, I realized that the path forward was no longer clear. Sitting at the kitchen table, the envelope still in front of me, I felt the weight of every choice I had ever made in my life pressing down. Ethan's calm presence across from me made it worse. He moved with that familiar confidence, the kind that used to make me proud when he was a boy. But now it carried an edge I hadn't recognized before. My mind kept cycling through the numbers, the notices, the reality of that $300,000 debt. I remembered all the sacrifices I had made over the years, how I had worked nights and weekends to keep us afloat, how I had saved every penny from my late husband's pension and the sale of our apartment. That money had been my security, my plan for these quiet years. And yet here it was, demanded, as if it were nothing more than a resource to be tapped, as if family loyalty meant absolute obedience. For a moment, I wanted to push back, to remind him of the years I had poured into raising him, into building a life he could step into without fear. But I saw the urgency in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, and I felt the familiar pang of guilt that had accompanied so many of my decisions as a mother. I could almost hear my husband's voice reminding me that family comes first, that we do what we can to protect the ones we love. I thought about all the times I had said yes, all the ways I had taught Ethan to depend on others, to believe that asking was the same as deserving. And now, that lesson was turning back on me in the cruelest way. My hands trembled as I touched the papers, and I felt a wave of disbelief, anger, and fear all at once. I realized then that the choice I was facing wasn't simple. Giving him the money would protect him. Yes, but it would leave me vulnerable and stripped of the very safety I had worked for. Refusing would mean standing up to my own son, risking his anger, and challenging the version of family loyalty I had always held dear. As I sat there, staring at the stack of notices, I couldn't help but wonder, how had it come to this? How had a life built on trust and love turned into a situation where saying no felt impossible? And yet, deep down, I knew that whatever I chose next would change everything. The morning light fell across the table, catching the red marks on the loan documents. And I realized that in that quiet, ordinary kitchen, a defining moment of my life had arrived. It was no longer about being a good mother. It was about being true to myself, and the answer was not yet clear. After Ethan left, the house felt colder than it had in years. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft morning light, the faint aroma of coffee, it all seemed sharper somehow. Like the air itself was holding its breath. I sat by the window, staring at the driveway where his SUV had been, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. I realized he hadn't even said thank you, hadn't acknowledged what I had just given up for him. And in that absence, I could feel a truth settling over me. Something I had long avoided helping him hadn't felt like love anymore, it had felt like surrender. Memories washed over me, both tender and painful. I remembered late nights comforting him when he was sick, mornings teaching him to tie his shoes, the countless hours spent worrying over every scrape and heartbreak. All of those moments had been full of care and devotion, but now they felt like lessons in being taken for granted. I began to see patterns I had ignored for too long, the way I had always put others' needs before my own, the way my sacrifices had taught him to expect, not appreciate. I couldn't help but ask myself if I had been naive all those years. Had I mistaken compliance for love? Generosity for respect? I had always believed that family loyalty meant giving, and now, the very loyalty I had nurtured had been used as a tool against me. My chest tightened as I realized how easily my life could be emptied without my consent. And yet, in that quiet, painful clarity, a spark began to form. I understood for the first time that the power to change my life rested not in how much I gave, but in the choices I made for myself. It wasn't anger, I felt it was awakening. The same hands that trembled over those documents could also shape a new path. One where my needs and my safety mattered as much as anyone else's. I sat there for what felt like hours, letting the weight of the moment sink in. And I knew that the next steps I would take would define the rest of my life. This realization was both terrifying and liberating. And for the first time, in decades, I understood that standing up for myself was not betrayal, it was survival. By mid-afternoon, I had made up my mind. The life I had been living, the constant giving, the endless compromises, the quiet erosion of my security could not continue. I needed to reclaim, not just my money, but my sense of self. I remembered my oldest friend, Rebecca, a retired lawyer who had always been a steady presence through every storm. I called her, my voice low and deliberate, and explained everything: the demand, the debt, the way I felt cornered. There was a long pause, and then her voice, calm and unwavering, reminded me that I had rights, that I had options, and that sometimes the bravest act is to step away from those who take for granted what you give. Together, we began to plan. I would move what little remained of my savings into a secure account under her management, out of Ethan's reach. We would update legal documents to protect my home, and I would leave the city, at least temporarily, to regain clarity and safety. As I organized my papers, packed a few essentials, and wrote a short note for Ethan, a strange mix of fear and exhilaration ran through me. Every detail mattered: which clothes to take, which documents to secure, which items held the most meaning. Each decision was a quiet act of empowerment, a reclamation of the autonomy I had been denied for too long. The drive to the bank and the notary felt surreal. I remember the early evening light catching the streets, the way the air smelled faintly of autumn leaves and something else: possibility. Rebecca's presence was steady, grounding me through each step. For the first time, I felt like the architect of my own life, rather than a passenger in someone else's drama. By the time I returned to the empty house to leave the note, I no longer felt the weight of obligation pressing on my shoulders. I didn't linger. The door closed behind me with a quiet finality that felt like breathing for the first time in decades. As I drove toward the unknown, I realized that courage wasn't about confrontation or anger, It was about choosing myself when the world expected otherwise. And in that moment, as the city receded behind me and the first hints of night fell across the horizon, I understood something I had long forgotten. Freedom has a scent, a texture, and a taste. And it begins with the decision to step away from what no longer serves you. I arrived at the small cabin Rebecca had arranged for me, just as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. It wasn't grand. Just one bedroom, a porch that faced the lake, and the kind of quiet that feels almost unfamiliar when you've spent decades surrounded by noise and demands. But to me, it felt like a palace. I remember stepping onto the porch and taking a deep breath, letting the air wash over me. The scent of pine, the subtle salt of the lake, and the gentle rustle of leaves felt like the first real touch of freedom I had known in years. Inside, I unpacked only the essentials. But even the smallest items carried significance. A framed photograph of my late husband, a favorite sweater, my journals, all pieces of a life I was reclaiming for myself. I brewed a cup of tea and carried it outside, letting the warmth spread through my hands as I watched the ripples on the water. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Ethan. But for the first time, I didn't feel compelled to respond. I realized I could exist without immediate justification, without answering to anyone else's expectations. Sitting there in the quiet, I reflected on how easily I had given myself away to others, how my life had been defined by what I provided instead of who I was. And yet, this stillness was not loneliness, it was a canvas. For the first time, I felt the possibility of choosing what mattered to me, without fear or guilt. I began to imagine a routine built around my own needs. The activities I had put aside for decades, reading, writing, walks by the lake, and the simple pleasure of making my own decisions. The peace wasn't immediate, it came in small waves, sometimes interrupted by memories or pangs of worry. But each moment reinforced a truth I had forgotten: that life can continue, can flourish, even after betrayal and exhaustion. As night fell, and the first stars appeared above the water, I felt something shift within me. This was not just a place, it was the beginning of a life reclaimed. And as I settled into that quiet rhythm, I understood that independence isn't just a destination, it's a series of choices. Each one a step away from the past and toward the person I wanted to be. Just as I was beginning to feel a fragile sense of stability, my phone rang with a name I hadn't expected: Sophia. My daughter-in-law. Her voice trembled in a way that made my heart tighten instantly. Ethan was spiraling, she said. Drinking too much, lashing out, and threatening everyone around him. The fear in her words was unmistakable, and I felt that old maternal instinct kick in, the one that had always urged me to protect my family, even when it cost me dearly. I thought about the lessons I had learned in the past few days, that saying yes at the wrong time had nearly drained me completely, that giving without boundaries could be dangerous. But this was different. This wasn't about blind loyalty or debt, it was about helping someone vulnerable find safety. And I realized I could do it. Because I had taken the steps to protect myself first, I started to plan quietly, carefully, imagining the safest way to help Sophia and the children. Each decision mattered: how they could leave without being tracked, where they could stay, what resources they would need. I recalled the feeling of my own freedom, the calm clarity I had felt on that porch by the lake, and I knew I could extend a portion of it to them, without putting myself at risk. As I worked through the logistics in my mind, I felt a strange blend of empowerment and caution. I was no longer the woman who had given everything without question. I was thinking strategically, deliberately, and with intention. Every action was measured. Every choice weighed with the knowledge that my past had taught me well. And as I prepared to act, I understood something profound: helping others doesn't mean sacrificing yourself. For the first time, I could see a path where care and self-preservation coexisted, where empathy did not equal vulnerability, I realized that guiding Sophia and the children to safety would not only protect them, it would also reinforce the strength I had just reclaimed for myself. That night, as I looked out at the lake reflecting the moonlight, I felt a calm resolve. I wasn't just escaping my past anymore. I was creating a future where I could act with purpose, protect those in need, and finally live by the choices I made, not by the demands of others. A few days later, a knock at the door startled me. This time it wasn't Ethan. It was Detective Rachel Grant. Calm and professional, yet with a warmth that immediately put me at ease. She explained that Ethan had been involved in financial fraud and identity misuse, that several accounts had been opened under my name without my knowledge. As I absorbed this, a swirl of disbelief, shame, and anger washed over me. The person I had trusted the most had turned my own identity into a tool for his schemes. I thought back on every transfer, every moment I had put my faith in him, and the hollow ache of betrayal settled deep in my chest. Yet, for the first time, I didn't feel powerless. I understood that I could take control of this situation not by confronting him with anger, but by choosing to protect myself and others. Cooperating with Detective Grant meant using the knowledge I had and the boundaries I had built to stop him before anyone else was hurt. As I provided every detail I knew, my own narrative became the weapon for justice. I realized that my life, my careful attention to detail over decades, could counteract the recklessness of someone who had learned to take without giving. Ich document. Each memory, each calculated step became part of a story that could finally hold him accountable. The arrest came swiftly, and I remember standing in my kitchen afterward, a phone pressed to my ear, feeling the strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Ethan was my son, and yet he had become someone I barely recognized. It wasn't triumph that filled me, it was recognition of the hard truth, that sometimes the right choice is the one that hurts the heart but saves the soul. Sitting quietly afterward, I realized that I had survived the storm not by luck, but by learning to honor myself first. I had been used. Yes. But I was no longer a victim, and though the road ahead would require continued vigilance, I felt something I hadn't in years: clarity. The chaos Ethan created no longer defined me. I had reclaimed the power to define my own life. In the weeks after Ethan's arrest, I began to rebuild a life that felt wholly my own. The cabin by the lake became more than a refuge, it became a space to reconnect with myself. I started volunteering at the local community center, teaching women how to manage small home businesses and budgets. Watching their eyes light up with possibility reminded me that the strength I had rediscovered wasn't just for me, it could ripple outward. Some days, I still felt the ache of betrayal. I thought of all the years spent giving freely, trusting blindly, and wondering how I hadn't seen the patterns earlier. But I no longer let those memories weigh me down. They were lessons, to reminders that my worth was never defined by how much I could give at the expense of my own well-being. Then, one quiet afternoon, I received a letter from Ethan. I braced myself, unsure of whether it would be manipulative or full of excuses, but as I read, I realized it was something else entirely. He acknowledged the ways he had used me, the control he had exerted, and the truth he had refused to face. There were no pleas for forgiveness, just honesty. For the first time, I saw him as the flawed human he had become, not the child I had raised. That night, I sat on the porch, the lake shimmering in the soft light, and I allowed myself to feel gratitude for my independence, for my clarity, for the life I had chosen. I understood that peace isn't silence or absence of pain, it's the quiet strength to live on your own terms, to make decisions guided by self-respect, and to recognize that sometimes the hardest boundaries are the ones that save you. As I looked at the horizon, I felt a calm I hadn't known in decades. The years I had lost to overgiving could not be reclaimed, but the life ahead was mine to shape. And in that moment, I realized that freedom isn't something that comes easily, but it is worth every act of courage, every hard choice, and every moment spent reclaiming yourself. Months later, I found myself sitting on the porch, the lake reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. I had shared my story with a small audience at the community center, telling them how I had learned to say no, to set boundaries, and to reclaim my life. Their eyes glistened with recognition, and some even whispered that my courage gave them hope for their own lives. I realized then that the greatest gift of all wasn't the safety I had secured or the peace I had found. It was the ability to show others that starting over, even after betrayal, is possible. The letters from Sophia and the smiles of the women I mentored reminded me that strength and compassion can coexist, and that empowerment can ripple outward in ways we never anticipate. As I turned toward the horizon, I felt a calm certainty. Life doesn't have to be defined by what others take from you, but by the choices you make for yourself. I picked up my camera and began to record, sharing my story with anyone who might need to hear it, encouraging them to stand firm, to protect their peace, and to believe in new beginnings. If my journey resonates with you, I hope you'll share your own story. Leave a comment, and remember that it's never too late to reclaim your life and your freedom.